Welcome to Arena Stage and welcome to our Civil Dialogues conversation today. My name is Renee Littleton. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications, and we are excited to kick off our second conversation of our FY20 season. We are about partnering with Professor Amitai and Etzioni about great conversation that feature lively dialogue, featuring subject matter that are impacting us today, and I'm sure today's conversation will be quite informative and exciting as well. So without further ado, thank you all for coming, and let's enjoy our civil dialogues today. Professor.
Well, thank you very much. It's been indeed a very productive collaboration. We have a surprisingly smaller turnout today than usually. We moved it to Wednesday. We usually don't do them on Wednesday, and I think that confused things a little, but give you all a chance to have more time during the question and answer discussion period. I've been now moderated in this for 15 dialogues, and I'm finally cannot hold back anymore. I must tell you how much I'm suffering, because on all these wonderful things we are discussing, I have some very wonderful, strong ideas, and I never get a chance to talk about them because I have to, with pleasure, listen to my colleagues and bite my tongue. I have all kind of blue little marks, one for each dialogue, where I have to hold back. So today, I will still have to do the same thing, but I'll tell you, those of you who want to see what I have to say on that, I just published a whole book for you. It's called Reclaiming Patriotism, and you can download it for free. So those of you who can possibly wait, what I would say if I was not the moderator. So, now, as the moderator, let me just quickly frame the issue, and very much look forward to listening to a very, very excellent panel. It's the headline news that virulent nationalism is sweeping throughout many democracies and challenging them severely. It does to different degrees, but it's really practically inescapable. The most recent, very troubling example is what's happening in India. India is promoting Hindu nationalism, despite the fact that there are 200 million Muslims living in this country. Recently, India removed the autonomy of a part of Kashmir, which the one state in which the Muslim had a majority, but more consequential, even worse, they're changing the citizen law. So if you are a Muslim, you're either a second-class citizen or you're a state-led person. That's aside from other limited but authoritarian trends. Turkey used to be a solid secular democracy. It wasn't flawless, but few of them are. But again, it's now moving quite rapidly to concentrating power in the hand of the president, limiting the assembly, limiting the judges, and repressing the press, and moving to kind of Islamic radicalism. You see it in Hungary and in Poland. And even in other countries which have not gone as far, all over, in Britain and France, even in Germany now, we have right-wing nationalist parties. And what people note less often, that it's not only did this party emerge, they get their share of headlines, but the whole political spectrum in this country is moving to the right, because parties which used to be relatively moderate find they have to move to the right in order to compete and try to siphon off some of the votes from the right wing. And of course, it leads now to this attempt of Britain to break away from the European Union. It has an odd feature, this particular wave of nationalism, which frankly sociologists are very puzzled by. Usually when you have nationalism, it emphasizes national unity. So you would think that this nation will become aggressive, by the way, mainly against immigrants, that they somehow would solidify internally. But oddly enough, they combine this belligerency and authoritarianism with internal fragmentation, which tears society apart and paralyzes government. And to save time, let me just give you one example. Look at Britain, the mother of democracy. You have three camps. Those who want to leave the EU at any cost and price, those who want to stay, and those who want to leave under certain conditions. Fine. So there's three camps. And in any functioning democracy, you work something out after a while. Not necessarily a mindless compromise. A third way, a 2.5 way, not that for 3 years, completely paralyzes the government and increasing hatred among the various groups. We, of course, have some of these problems at home. And again, I want to emphasize it's not just political. The parties are becoming tribalized. It's one detail which is kind of almost funny, but very telling. Democrats don't want their daughters to marry Republicans, and Republicans don't want their daughters to marry Democrats. That kind of divisiveness we have. So the question which is before the House, we discuss among other things, is what is the most effective response to this tidal wave of nationalism? One answer has been given, goes under the label of cosmopolitanism, globalism. Globalism basically takes a position that given this experience, this bitter experience, the threat to democracy, that it's time to move to a post-national period that will give up on these tribalisms and become one global community. After all, many of our problems are global and cannot be handled anymore on a basis of one nation at a time. Take climate change. If 2 countries, 3 countries, even China and the United States reduce their emission, but India just signed up a multi-billion-dollar contract to buy the dirtiest coal from Australia, and they burn it, there will be no net gain to climate. It has to be a global effort. The same about human trafficking, Ebola, many issues have become global. And in fact, we have some little factors which seem that we could do that. For instance, usually it's not mentioned in polite company, we have in a global language, it's called English. The French and the Germans hate it. But the fact is that when let's say the Greeks and the Finns or the Norwegians and the French meet, they talk English. With exceptions, some parts of Africa where French is the language. Practically all over the place we have a language. We, of course, can get a message across the world in seconds. We can travel in a day. So it seems like that might be one answer. On the other hand, some of us feel that this globalism, in effect, is pouring gasoline on the fires of nationalism because it so enrages people whose strongest commitment is still to the nation state, that is one thing which drives them to further dig into their national loyalties. And last, one other answer to virulent nationalism is to think about that there's some other, much more benign, much more tolerant form of nationalism. De Gaulle put it like this. He said that patriotism is love of country. Nationalism is hatred of other countries. If you go to the dictionary, you find that one definition of nationalism is lording over other countries. The other definition of nationalism is a rationale for gaining independence for your people. So just to remind, nationalism used to be the war of liberations, which led nations all over the world to push out the European colonizers and get independence for their people. Now, usually this is the terms I used, blood and soil nationalism or ethnic nationalism. On the other side, civic nationalism. I prefer the terms patriotism, but this is a kind of academic hair splitting. The main question is, we're facing a major threat to democracy from nationalism. How should we best effectively treat it? So our panel, I know, will follow the tradition we have here of having a civil dialogue. We even had Trump supporters and Trump opponents here having a civil dialogue. So tonight is going to be a cakewalk. But just to be absolutely sure, I want you to know, I told this to the panel earlier, this is the theater. So there are trapdoors below their seats. Would you please, we have a tradition of not introducing people because you have their bio in your program. Would you please?
Thank you very much. I'm Nora Ben-Sahel. I'm from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C. The flyer for this evening's event and the one that is prominently on the front of your program poses a very provocative question, which is, what is wrong with nationalism? And I want to start by saying there is nothing wrong with nationalism, right? It's, as you described in its definition, right? This is a term that has to do with identification with a nation state, with a sense of self-determination, and usually some sort of pride in or loyalty to the state and its principles, as you described. And there's nothing that's inherently wrong with that sentiment, right? It can often be a positive force, and the best example for that is the United States itself. We are a state based on values and principles, and we wouldn't be here without that sentiment. But nationalism is an ism, and like all isms, the problem with it is its most extreme versions. Right? When it gets taken to an extreme, it becomes, your wonderful quote about how it becomes hatred of other countries. And so it is the extreme versions that become problematic, when it becomes a real sense of superiority over other countries, and when it becomes a sense that it's your duty to spread that view because you are superior. That's when you get into problems with the concept. But it's not, we don't think of it that way in our current discourse, but those things are extreme versions of what we mean when we talk about nationalism. So I'm a nationalist as an American in a way because I believe that the values and principles of the United States are extraordinarily strong. I think they're the best form of government, and I have a lot of pride in our country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I believe we're superior to all other countries, that we have a duty to expand our values and impose that on others. That, of course, leads to aggression, it can lead to war, and it can also lead different groups in society to conflate their own identities with that of the nation state. And I'm sure we'll hear more about how that can lead to more extremist views. But it does tend to be used by people who want to rally around a common ideology. It's not coincidental that Hitler's party in Germany called itself the National Socialists, right? The national part of that was a very key element of trying to bring everyone together under what was obviously an extraordinarily extremist and abhorrent ideology. And in this country, we have a long history of white nationalism, right? Which, as we all know, has undergone a great resurgence recently, and which has some of our citizens believing that whites are in a superior position to other members of society and need to exert that. So again, the basic principles can be twisted and can be made very extreme, but that doesn't mean that we should throw out the concept of it altogether. There is another problem, and you mentioned this with the concept of nationalism, and that is it does lead us to focus on our own nations and our own states rather than looking at global challenges. And there are all sorts of global issues that get short shrift from that focus on states. Climate change is the big one, obviously, but you mentioned some others, global pandemics and global poverty and health issues. But I would say that I am, above all, a pragmatist. I don't consider myself an ideologue on any particular part of the spectrum. And I believe that nationalism is too powerful of an ideology to be going away anytime soon. I think that there is something inherent in people that looks for groups, that looks for tribal affiliations. And so I reject this idea that you mentioned, not that you espouse it, but that you mentioned, that we should somehow leave nationalism behind to build a global community, to have our identities be built on that as global citizens, because I just don't think that's practical. I think that people identify themselves with their groups, and for better or worse, the groups that we identify with are mostly nations and states in this international system. I do think we need to all think more globally, and in addition to thinking globally, we need to invert the phrase, we don't need to be acting locally all the time, we need to be acting globally as well. That doesn't mean it's an isolationist thing. And the United States, for much of its history, has chosen to support global interests more than its own narrowly defined national interests. And so, of course, there's room for that as well. But I want to end my comments with the fact that there is a key problem with how nationalism is viewed in the United States today that goes beyond the things that I've mentioned. And that's that nationalism has become linked to patriotism, this idea that you mentioned, and that has become linked to a particular partisan ideology, which I think is deeply, deeply problematic. Again, I'm a pragmatist. I don't want to focus on why or how that came to be, but I think it's a fact that we have to live with, that there is one side of the political spectrum, the Republican side or the conservative side, that has deeply embraced patriotic symbols and flags and other symbols of United States national identity, and has made it sort of the centerpiece of a lot of political campaigns. If you travel around traditionally Republican or conservative areas, if you travel in the South or in rural areas, you'll see a lot of American flags flying. You won't see that many if you travel along the coasts or in urban areas where Democrats or liberals tend to live. And I don't think that's a good thing for our polity, to have one side or the other be identified with our national symbols and be seen to have an exclusive hold on those, and for those to be seen as problematic and representative of one type of political ideology, because they belong to the nation and they belong to all Americans. We live in an extraordinarily divided time, as of course you know, and I think that the best way to bridge those divides is to focus again on what we all have in common in this country. But I think that the term nationalism now is seen as too partisan to be helpful in bridging that divide. So instead of relying on a sense of nationalism to help heal our divides, I would suggest refocusing the conversation on civics and civic education, and particularly on citizenship. I don't mean that in terms of who deserves to be a citizen versus who doesn't deserve to be a citizen. I mean citizenship in terms of the communal obligations that we all take on to each other as citizens in a republic. That part, the responsibilities part of citizenship, I think is very often given short shrift, not understood enough. And I think that, for those of us who were born in the United States, like I am, we don't think a lot about that. It's just sort of taken for granted. But if you weren't born here, like my father wasn't born here, you have to actually take an oath of citizenship, and you pledge your loyalty not only to the Constitution as the guiding principle of our country, but to all of the obligations of what citizenship entails. And I would like to see our conversation focus mostly on that, on what we define ourselves by in this country, our values of tolerance, of common engagement, of efforts like this, to try to have dialogues that bridge people of different views, and to have more of an understanding of the obligations of tolerating other people's ideas in the context of citizenship of this country, because I think that's a way to help bridge the divides that are so deeply dividing us.
Thank you. So what troubles me most when we look out at American politics today is the way we're being divided again into tribes. The racist right is trying to divide Americans according to their skin color, according to their race, and they're serious about it. The woke left is trying to divide us by our skin color and by our race, and they're serious about it. And we're being divided regionally. This famous divide between the coasts and the heartland. We see truth in it, especially when entire regions of the country are losing their industries, their ability to make a living, their ability to have the kind of middle-class life that was once far more common. So when we look out and see America being divided regionally, economically, by race, it seems to me, I would challenge de Gaulle's quote. I would say, what we need is nationalism. What we need is an American nationalism. Because patriotism asks us to love our country, but that's not enough. Today we need not only to love our country, but to love one another. We need to love our fellow citizens. And the best phrase for that, the best category for that I've seen and can think of is the category of nationalism. Nationalism says, because you are my fellow citizen, I share a bond with you that is deep and real and profound and should lead me to want to sacrifice for your welfare. That is achievable, and that is something that once existed more. It's something I think we can work to try to bring back. And it would have implications for us across a few different areas of policy. One of them is immigration. But more interesting than how we change immigration, I think, is the flip side of immigration, which is assimilation. I don't think we do a very good job of assimilation. I think some people are offended by the very notion of assimilation. But at one time, it was part and parcel of our immigrant-based system that immigrants would come here and be assimilated. And you look back at leaders like Hamilton and Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, and they spoke at length about the fact that this assimilation was one that went beyond mere abstract ideals, merely accepting the principles of the Declaration. It was actually something deeper. It was connecting us to this soil and to one another in a more visceral and profound way, connecting us really to the history of this country. Lincoln speaks famously of this, connecting to the patriots' graves and battlefields as something that binds us together. And I think there's something real there. I would say my nationalist role model, the nationalist who most influenced me, was not Charles Lindbergh, but my Jewish grandfather. And my Jewish grandfather came to this country and dedicated himself. No one made him. He said, this country took me in. This country gave me refuge. There's something great about this country that took in someone so different from the founders, so different in culture and religion and background from the founders. I want to find out what made this country so great. He dedicated himself to learning English. He dedicated himself to learning the history. And I think he was as connected to those battlegrounds and those patriot graves as Lincoln envisioned an American would be. So it's going to have profound implications for assimilation of immigrants, whatever our immigration policy is. Number one. Number two, it's going to have profound implications for our economics. The free market is fantastic. It is the greatest engine of prosperity human history has known. It has brought more people out of poverty to a good standard of living than any other economic system. It's on the verge of sacrilege for a conservative to dare question laissez-faire. But I question laissez-faire because other things have to be put on the scales when we figure out what will create the greatest prosperity for the largest number of Americans, And on that scale, we put things like the environment. We could have a higher GDP if we gave waste to our rivers and our lakes. We don't do that. The environment's on the scales. I think the welfare of our fellow Americans in communities that are losing their industries and hurting has to also be placed on the scales. And if I love my fellow Americans, if this bond we have has any meaning, then I should be willing to give up some GDP for their welfare and their well-being and the flourishing of their communities. And that's got to be part of the debate. It's got to be on the scales. And finally, foreign policy. I think in the introduction to this event, it was suggested that nationalism leads inevitably to, it was suggested, some think, it leads to jingoism, it leads to an aggressive foreign policy. It can. Bad formulations of these ideals certainly can lead to aggression. But I think if anything today, those of us who call ourselves American nationalists actually go in a different direction. A direction, and this is a weighted, freighted phrase, of America first. Not in its past iterations, not in the xenophobic or anti-Semitic ways that this has been used, but in a sense of shouldn't our foreign policy first and foremost be focused on the welfare of us and our fellow citizens? Shouldn't other ideals like spreading democracy or nation building come in second to, first and foremost, what is in the best interest of America and Americans. And I think, if anything, this type of nationalist foreign policy will lead to fewer foreign interventions, more careful foreign interventions, than other iterations of what foreign policy should be or what the national interest is. So, immigration, assimilation, economic policy, and foreign policy. I think what America needs today is a new nationalism, one that is blind to race, one that is blind to ethnicity, one that is focused on what we share as citizens, and elevating it, building it, strengthening it, and giving it expression in our policies. So what's bad about nationalism? Nothing at all.
Very good. My name is Rasan Maxwell. I'm a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And there may actually be some more agreement if we sift underneath the comments here. But my general direction of my comments is that nationalism is a problem and should be moderated. The direction we want to go as humans is to weaken nationalism, and for three reasons. The first is that I'm not saying that any of the other panelists were suggesting this, but nationalism is not natural. We're not born out of the womb as members of a nation. It's constructed. It's created, and it's created in a particular time in history in a response to particular historical issues, namely feudalism. So the planet all over used to be governed by monarchs and some form of people who had no, they won battles and put themselves in power. They weren't elected to their positions. And so nationalism was a response, saying that, look, the people need to have some lever and mechanism to control who's governing them. And we are one people who want to break away from these rulers that don't seem to represent us. And so that was a response throughout history. This also applies to colonialism, that the rulers didn't seem to represent the ruled. And that was fine in the 18th century, in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, we have different issues. 21st century, we have different issues that we need to face. And some of them were raised earlier. The second point is that, so nationalism is not natural. It's not inevitable. It rose at a particular time in history for particular historical issues. And the second point is that it's not very practical. As you said, there are both global issues that we've mentioned, some of them, like the environment, but also local issues, because how many of us live our lives as Americans in a daily life? You're more likely to live your life as part of your community, or as part of your local community, or as part of a region. Within whatever America is, there are many different regions with many different needs and many different interests. And so why should we draw the salient border at America, or the United States? It's a rather arbitrary one in between humans and our local community. So to me, it seems much more reasonable that we think about global issues. We should be moving towards global issues that we can fight as humans, and then regional issues that we fight for the local, regional interests and needs. And government can be flexible to accommodate these things. We don't have to remain with the same levels of government administration that we had 200 years ago or 300 years ago. We fluctuate over time, and to me, these seem the most salient. So it's more practical to think about global issues as well as local communities. And then the third one is, nationalism as this arbitrary level of analysis, this arbitrary level of human categorization, in between our lived lives and the globe. It's very exclusionary, and it lends itself towards these exclusionary reasons for ways that are not even necessarily very logical. And so, again, as I think one of the goals of humanity is to move, we're definitely going to categorize ourselves in us versus them. And as I tell my students all the time, until the aliens come, it's probably unlikely that we're going to have a human us, but we should be moving in that direction. And so we do need to have nations. I think practically speaking, we need passports, we need border control, but all of that should become, in my view, a much more administrative and much less emotional. And perhaps that is what some of the other panelists were getting at when they talk about less of an ethnic nation and more of a civic nation. There's someone to control the borders, but not necessarily to live as deeply in your hearts. And we can perhaps have some dialogue and debate about that. But that is my view, that it's something that is no longer as necessary as it once was.
My name is Rusty Reno, and I am the editor of First Things magazine, a monthly journal of religion and culture and public life. Nationalism. The isms are always a problem. They tend towards a certain kind of extreme. I mean, liberalism tends towards an anti-democratic sentiment, and it can often promote a certain sort of radical individualism that can be destructive. Socialism tends towards to be anti-liberal and harmful to the individual, but these isms pick up important truths. I mean, liberalism picks up the important truth of the dignity of the individual to be cherished for his or her own sake. Socialism picks up the importance of solidarity. And so nationalism, while it has excesses, I think also picks up important truths about the human condition that we should honor. One is what I would call the appointed character of any people. In other words, there's something fitting that this people live in this place, and nationalism picks that up, this quality of human life. Second feature that it picks up is the intrinsic good of self-government. It is more dignified to shape your own future and your own destiny than to live as a pawn in the hands of greater powers. I think nationalism picks that up, the good of self-government. Also, it picks up the intrinsic good of a shared heritage. I mean, taken individually, we are small and mediocre, but insofar as we participate in a larger project, we can participate in something that is noble and worthy of admiration. The fourth thing I think it picks up is that nationalism insists that we are united in a common project. And so as a result, the rich and the powerful must use their position in order to promote the good of the whole, the good of the nation, and not promote their own interests. I think nationalism is a very important mechanism for restraining the tendency of the wealthy few to use their wealth and power to their own benefit and not to the benefit of the many. Then liberalism, I think nationalism, is therefore especially important today. I would submit that the greatest threat to freedom is an increasingly powerful, globalized oligarchy, and that I look with dread on the idea of any kind of global government, because it would be run by people fundamentally unaccountable, because a certain kind of technocratic regime could be very efficient, I suppose, but it's a terrible temptation for the rich and the powerful to serve their own interests. And so I think today we see a rise in an important corrective in the direction of nationalism. I think Elizabeth Warren's platform of economic patriotism, which is what she calls it, clearly reflects an attempt to recover to redirect the wealth of the few in the direction of the interests of the many. I mean, as a conservative, I have all kinds of reservations about the mechanisms that she's proposing, but I thoroughly endorse the sentiment behind her policies. The need to rebalance our economic system, as David Brogg pointed out, we need to rebalance our economic system in the direction of the high school educated American so that the high school educated American can prosper. And then I think we see on the American right the complete eclipse of Paul Ryan's austerity politics that was aiming at rolling back middle-class entitlements has completely been wiped off the map of the American right. And I think that also reflects the influence of nationalism. So I think in terms of the challenges that we face as a country today, nationalism and the element of ism here, which separates it from patriotism as a sentiment, nationalism is an orientation of policy. It says we need specific policies that are oriented towards renewing the social bonds that unite us as a nation. And they are cultural politics as well as obviously economic politics and policies.
Well, there's been already an excellent start, and having you being as brief as asked allows us to have another quick 2 little rounds about some specific questions which came up during the discussion. So one I want to ask you all, maybe you give another brief answer, is the question, throughout much of American history, at least since President Wilson, part of our self-definition of as a nation was our obligation to bring human rights and democracy to other nations. And that had led to a variety of policies. For instance, most recently in Afghanistan, where after we defeated the Taliban in 3 weeks, we stayed for 18 years in an attempt to engage in a democracy and human rights building. And even now, as we negotiate with the Taliban about leaving, the question keeps on coming up. Even if they would promise us never to give home to terrorists again, wouldn't they endanger women's rights and human rights? Should we not continue fighting for human rights in Afghanistan? That issue also came up in Libya. Originally, we intervened in Libya to prevent a humanitarian crisis. But as the rebels marched over Tripoli, Gaddafi came and said, well, let's sit down and negotiate. And there was a possibility of kind of splitting 2 parts, eastern and western Libya, or finding some kind of a settlement. But the American position was, we want democracy, we want regime change. Settlement is not enough, you have to go. For the first 4 years in the war in Syria, the United States announced as a precondition for sitting down with the government of Syria was that the government would leave. Now, it usually is very difficult to negotiate with somebody if your precondition is that they go to hell. So the question I want to ask you, should we give up on that ethos, as I think one of you implied, of bringing our great values, our exceptional values, to other countries? And how far should we go? When we go the other direction, maybe can we start from the other end? So.
Yes, Wilsonianism, right. I think Americans believe that the natural condition of the human person is to be an American. And so therefore all we need to do is remove the impediments and they automatically become American. This is a species of American universalism that I think is naive about the human condition. It's false and it's imperialistic, and I think it's we need to be very careful to restrain ourselves in that matter. And then in terms of human rights, obviously very important, should be a key part of our diplomacy, but it should be pursued with a very strong realism. Human rights absolutism is all war all the time. And I mean, one of the things that I find so troubling about a certain kind of idealism about democracy promotion and human rights protection is it really sanctions the United States military in a kind of constant wartime footing throughout the world. It's crazy, it seems to me, and I think John Q. Public is exhausted after now how many years? We're coming up on 20 years of war. Starting with the invasion of Afghanistan, and I think my experience is driving the country. People are saying, we got problems at home, and maybe we should try to solve them rather than solving the world's problems.
So that's a great question. I don't really understand when people talk about American values or any country's values for that matter. It's a little bit too abstract. I think we can go too far in claiming that nations have values. I mean, what happens is there are people, specific people, in specific historic moments who want to do specific things In this case, they wanted to remove themselves from England, and they had a certain number of principles that they used in that fight. But then if you go over time, these abstract values mean many different things to many different people, all across the country. And so, we talk about the early 20th century. Wilson, there's a particular world in which there were nations that were fighting each other, and there was an attempt to fight against colonial empires and struggles and these kinds of things. And so that is also situated. Today, it seems to me the situation is that we need more global coordination. There are a lot of things that these nations can't do. And so, yes, it doesn't mean that there's going to be one global government necessarily, but I don't know that America has any truly universal or timeless abstract principles that it needs to follow into wars. I think you can always look at what is in our interest, what do we want to do, and who is it good for, and these questions will be debated in the terms of the time. So that's my response.
Can I stay with you just for one more minute?
Yes.
So one other thing which developed over the years is the responsibility to protect. And that notion that if there's a genocide in a country, other nations not only have a right but an obligation to interfere. Would you consider that also kind of one of those abstractions?
Well, it's definitely an abstraction. Who responsible to who? To what? Are you responsible to the voters or to shame? I mean, yes, and different people will answer that question differently. And so obviously it's a question that can be debated. Should we do this? And you can have a debate, a civil dialogue, but there's no abstract truth behind it. I mean, who's deciding that truth? It's a decision that people arrive through civil dialogue.
Dr. Etzioni, that's a critical question you raise, and a critical dilemma, I think, for anyone who cares, caring about your fellow citizens and saying that bond is sacred, I care about that first, doesn't mean you forget about humanity and obligations to humanity. The question is, how do you prioritize them? The group that I'm involved with that is supporting what we call national conservatism is called the Edmund Burke Foundation. And one of Edmund Burke's ideals or insights was that when you take abstract ideas and try to impose them upon a complex society, it doesn't always work so well. His test case was the French Revolution. How is it that this man was able to see immediately virtue in the American Revolution and great danger in the French Revolution? I think he understood the American Revolution was being fought within the context of Anglo-American civilization, Anglo-American culture, and it was really an effort to assert the rights of Englishmen for Americans. It wasn't a break with our tradition. It wasn't a break with our heritage. It wasn't the imposition of abstract ideas upon a rooted, connected, complex society. For me, my humanitarian impulse was mugged by the reality of the Iraq War with the best of intentions. And people say it was all about oil, it was cynical. I don't believe that. I think it was largely for the best of intentions. I mean, how many countries have sent their sons and daughters off to war to liberate another people from oppression? The annals of history don't have many examples. To me, the noble impulse drove us to this. You can argue there were other considerations. It was largely, I believe, a noble impulse. Thousands of the flower of our youth came back in boxes. Trillions of dollars that could have gone to revitalizing our cities, to rebuilding our industries, were thrown into the desert, sucked up by the sands like so much water. What do we have to show for it? What do we have to show for it? A government that seems more loyal or afraid of Tehran than Washington. I mean, to me, this is a profoundly troubling reality. Our morals were put to the test, and at the end of the day, we wasted this impulse, this precious impulse to serve humanity, these precious dollars that could have served our fellow Americans. And so it showed me that while we might have the noblest of motives, we have to test them by the difficult reality of the world in which we live. And if we squander this precious altruism, we squander this precious impulse, we squander this treasure, the wrong time and the wrong challenge, it's not going to be there the next time when we do need it. Just a final thought. Saddam Hussein was a terrible threat to his own people. But I don't think he was such a threat to us. I look out in the world and I see Tehran, and if you study the Iranian Revolution, you know that they hate us. When they say death to America, they mean death to America. To me, this is a threat to our interests. I don't know if the public will is there to do anything about it because we squandered it in the wrong challenge at the wrong place at the wrong time. So we need to be very careful about these things. One last thought. The obligation to protect is something that speaks to me deeply as a Jewish American who's, like every Jewish American, lost family in the Holocaust. But even there, we need to be careful. What's going on right now with the Uyghurs in China, call it genocide, at least call it ethnic cleansing. There are over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps today, in our lifetimes. What are we doing about it? Nothing. Can we go to war to defend them? Should we go to war to defend them? That will isn't there, nor do I think it's the right thing to do with a power like China. So even that noblest of impulses runs up against the barriers of reality. In Somalia, we could do it. China, different kind of challenge.
So the tension you identified between national interests, meaning strategic interests, and human rights is one that goes throughout American foreign policy history. Right? And it's not resolvable. Those strands are always going to be there. American foreign policy is always going to be dictated by those dual impulses, right? To protect the nation and the threats that come the most directly at us as Americans. But we also do believe in some universal principles of human rights and human dignity, and I thought all the things that you mentioned so well in your remarks. You know, those are sort of hardwired into our civic DNA through the Constitution. And if you go back and look at American foreign policy, there's always tensions between them. There are times when we are inconsistent. We try to help human rights and help people who are living under atrocious conditions at some times and not others for reasons of practicality. Some of it is, where other countries don't have great interests, we can do it at lower cost in blood and treasure, and so we tend to do those more than others. But you just mentioned one. There are many other examples of these atrocities that are being committed around the world all the time. I don't think any American believes that we should be driven solely by human rights, that we need to intervene in every place where they are challenged. But I also don't think you'll get most Americans to say we should never take that into account in our foreign policy either, right? The trick is in an individual situation to gauge the relative costs and benefits. And we're never going to get that right because there's no abstract right there. It all depends on the situation. I thought that at the time, the invasion of Iraq was the worst strategic error that the United States has committed in its foreign policy history, and I thought that because I think a lot of the outcomes of that war were completely predictable. But what worries me now, we can't go back and change it. We have lost, that particular decision, which in my own view was so wrong-headed. Other people believe that it was the right thing to do. Again, reasonable people can disagree about that, but we are where we are today. And what I think the most tragic consequence of that is this sense of the United States should not be out there in the world and should pull back because what does it get us anyway after 20 years and counting of war, right? The United States, at the height of its global power, at the end of World War II, there was no greater power in the world by an order of magnitude than has probably been seen in human history. Okay, because we weren't devastated, and the countries of Europe and a lot of the countries in the Pacific were utterly devastated. And the United States did not choose to pursue only its own national interests, right? The United States could have set up a completely imperial system, could have set up a fortress around itself and walled itself off from all of the problems plaguing Europe and Japan and the rest of the global economy and polity. But instead, the United States did what you suggested we do, and you referred to in Elizabeth Warren's campaigns actually, which is sacrifice a bit of our own national power to create a system that didn't always benefit us the most, but that we thought gave the greatest benefit to the most people in the global system, including our own interest. You can't be divorced from that. But we set up a set of international institutions, and we had a policy of internationalism that guided how we thought about our role in the world. And the fundamental principles of that really weren't contested. The different political parties and different people fought like cats and dogs over the how. where we should go, what the policy should be, and so on. But it really isn't until Trump came along with this policy of America first and the isolationism that he means it with, that order started becoming really challenged in our political dialogue. Individuals may have held their own views, but that's really the first time since World War II that we've had that kind of challenge to America having an international role. Shortly after the 2016 election, I was at a discussion with some foreign policy analysts, national security types who know each other well, and a very prominently identified Democrat was talking with a very prominently identified Republican, and they said, don't you just miss the days when we hated each other, right? Because we disagreed about the how, we never realized that we had the same goals, right? That we all believed that America having an international role was best for the United States and best for as many people around the world as we could have. We fought like cats and dogs about how, but we believed in an international role. And that's one of the things that I think is most dangerous about this current moment that we're in, that we're giving up too much of that to construct a wall around ourselves, around an isolationist foreign policy that sees ourselves as divorced from the world and doesn't see our own national interests being somehow defined with lots of debate over how and when and who and why, but somehow defined as being a member of an international community.
Excellent. I'll get back to you in 1 minute. So just one last question, and again, if you can make it short so we can have time for discussion. And the term assimilation was raised, and I'd like to discuss it just for 1 minute. The reason it's important because one of the major factors which affects the recent wave of nationalism in Europe and in the United States is immigration. And there are other factors. I'm not saying it's all driven by immigration, but the response to immigration and that some people feel threatened by it or they're told they're threatened by it plays a major, major factor. And the question is how to deal with immigrants. And the term assimilation is used. It's a term open to different interpretations. The French interpretation is what sometimes in the United States called a melting pot, where you melt away all differences and everybody becomes an indistinguishable French, to the point that they won't even allow taking data on religious and ethnic differences. Or as Professor Maxwell mentioned earlier, they insist that everybody eat pork for lunch. The Swiss, the Muslim and Orthodox Jews don't like their girls to shake the hand of the teacher. In Switzerland, there's a tradition as children come to class, they shake the hand of the teacher. The Swiss will not tolerate an exemption. They insist that everybody becomes Swiss to the last decimal point. A counter image, which I think worked well in the United States, it's an image which is not mine, that of a mosaic. A mosaic which is more beautiful because there's pieces in different sizes, different colors, but it's held together by a frame. Means we want what I call diversity in unity. We want people to accept a whole list of commons, indeed obey the law, accept the Constitution, and so on and so on. But we tolerate or welcome if they pray to whoever they want to pray, if they have some special feelings about the countries of origin. So how much assimilation do we need? If you can turn to that briefly. Let's go this way, just starting with you.
Oh, I thought you would mix it up and start with the middle this time.
Be the moderator of the day. Let's start in the middle.
So how much assimilation do we need? The right amount. Look, the examples you cite from Europe as an American cite me as extreme because we also have a tradition in this country of religious freedom that is central to who we are and what we are. But so on the one extreme, this homogenization until we all accept the dietary and social rituals of the founding white Anglo-Saxon Protestants feels very extreme and foreign. But we've gone, I think the pendulum's gone too far in the other direction, where it feels now as if we're welcoming immigrants to this country who are not appreciating the nation and the culture and the society into which they have entered. It seems to me it's a good deal. We'll take you into America, if you recognize what is it that made America a beacon that you wanted to come to in the first place, recognize what it was and help us preserve that. Recognize maybe a debt of gratitude to this country that has opened its doors to you, an appreciation for the country that has made itself a place to which you want to immigrate, and then a commitment to preserving those things. The specifics of what those things are, it's a very difficult question, but as a fundamental proposition, it seems to me that should be the deal of our immigration. Immigrants have made the most patriotic of Americans, have made the greatest sacrifice as Americans. But that was this what came before that was a gratitude towards this country. And it's the gratitude towards this country of my immigrant grandparents that has informed my profound love and loyalty to America. I think it's a good model.
I'm afraid that my license as a moderator would be revoked if I not ask you to clarify which immigrants you're talking about who are not willing to accept the truth of America.
I don't think you can put them in any group. It's not so simple. But I do think you see instances now of immigrants who come to this country who don't have the admiration that other immigrants have, don't have the dedication that others have, but instead bring perhaps more of a criticism to the country and a critique of the country. I'm talking about individuals. I think it would be a dangerous and wrong-headed proposition to try to identify groups.
Okay, so this is actually one of my areas of study. I will make just one small note. France does not force people to eat pork. In fact, the critiques of people who don't want pork, France has responded by giving them vegetarian options, which satisfies Muslims as well as other people who don't want to eat pork for other reasons. And that's their way of doing it. But broadly speaking, I think everyone agrees that some efforts of assimilation are required. Personally, you could guess from what I said before, I think a more a limited, narrower set of criteria are useful, such as the language, obviously abiding by the laws, and passing whatever citizenship tests in terms of the history and the knowledge that you need. I think it's to some extent, and I'm not saying that this was being said in so many words by my other panelists, but often people say, oh, well, 100 years ago, these immigrants assimilated and they're not doing it today. I think that it's important to recognize, again, the historical context into when other people arrived versus this historical context. The historical context of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s was one where it was a much more national world. They didn't have access to global culture the same way we do today. There was a much more nationalizing influence through the three networks. It was a much more national world. Today, all of us are accessing culture from around the world, whether or not we were born in the United States or not. So it's not possible in today's society for natives, let alone for immigrants, to live inside of a nation-state box. And so therefore, as you said, specifying what it means culturally to be an American or a French person or a Swede or anything is really difficult when you want to put those words on paper without actually just being generic platitudes that are meaningless. So in my view, a limited assimilation so we can live peacefully, follow the laws, so on and so forth. Any attempt to mandate cultural norms it will lead you down a wrong path. In Europe, they've tried this in recent years. As many people may know, they proposed citizenship test questions that would ask you, are you comfortable, seeing women without tops at a beach? How would you feel if your son was gay? They were trying to ferret out, the homophobic and sexist Muslims, but it didn't work in part because people realize there's plenty of homophobia and sexism among the native Europeans. So it's really hard to specify these things.
Yeah, I think we should leave aside other countries. What's fitting in Switzerland is obviously not fitting in the United States. People use ethno-nationalism as a fright word, but I think in some national settings, it actually is integral to social solidarity. Estonia, Latvia, there are probably 2 or 3 million people in the world that speak Latvian. And if you care about preserving the language and handing it down to your children, then you're going to be, in some sense, an ethno-nationalist. Because it's only ethnically Latvian people who teach their children Latvian. And so I just think it's a very arrogant American thing to assume that what is fitting for our country and the things that we cherish about our country have to be true everywhere in the world. And that the Swiss can't have, a country of 6 million people, right, smaller than the city of New York where I live, can't have have a very different concern about how to preserve social solidarity than we have in the United States. So that's my, and I think Rasham and I, we agree on that. There's a lot of very specific to historical and cultural differences. But then on this issue of assimilation in the United States, I think we overestimate our diversity. We like to compliment ourselves in America about how diverse we are. And look, any foreigner that comes to this country has to just laugh at how recognizable the American character is, how widespread that American character is, how shocking it is that you can fly from Atlanta to Seattle, from Boston to Los Angeles, and you walk down the street and you're in the same damn country. And everybody knows it and feels it, and it's because we actually have a very thin but powerful culture. In fact, it's so powerful that it is a globalizing culture that erodes and undermines distinctive national identities throughout the world as kids watch our TV shows, play our computer games, and so forth. So I think I think we just need to recognize that I don't think assimilation really is a problem, and certainly not among immigrants. The typical critics of assimilation, or the critics of America, are native-born Americans. It's our university culture that is the seedbed of a great deal of, I won't call it anti-Americanism, it's a unique tradition of being an American to be a kind of fundamental critic of America. It kind of goes back to people like Henry David Thoreau and people like that. But still, it's out of our university culture. It's not being brought to our shores by people coming from Guatemala or people coming from Somalia or Ethiopia. I mean, I'm an American optimist. I think we do actually do a very good job in 2019 of assimilating immigrants into our culture. The children are taken away from their parents. It happens all the time. Every immigrant parent feels acutely the way in which they came to America hoping to raise their children in all the things they love about their own culture, fittingly, and also enjoy, be prosperous and live the American dream. And they wake up when their kids go off to college or are seniors in high school realizing, oh my gosh, my children are Americans. And I've lost them to American culture. This is often an agony for immigrant parents in the 21st century, just as it was an agony 100 years ago.
Very brief follow-up question. As a conservative and somebody believed in ethno-nationalism.
I don't believe in ethno-nationalism. I'm an American conservative.
Thank you for the correction. As an American conservative, is it part of immigrants should buy into? Is there a Jewish Christian tradition?
That's clearly in our cultural framework. It doesn't mean you have to become a Jew or a Christian, but it's clearly part of our, I would say Protestant Christianity is really part of our American culture. And so I'm a Catholic, so American Catholicism is a Protestantized kind of Catholicism. I think American Judaism is a Protestantized kind of Judaism, and I think American Islam will be a Protestantized form of Islam. It's a kind of a fate when you come here as an immigrant that you get swallowed by this kind of peculiar, individualistic, moralistic, this whole political correctness thing only in America. I mean, it's this intense moralism. It goes right to these kind of Protestant, they call it the Great Awakening, the third Great Awakening, the current climate on universities. And there's something to that. It's like only in America.
That is going to be the headline of the week for the left, that political correctness is based on Christianity.
So I want to push back strongly, civilly, but strongly, against what you said about the motivations for many. I understand you didn't say all, but for many immigrants coming to this country today. I think the reason why people come to this country today is the same reasons that it has always been, is that this is a land of economic opportunity where they can make better lives than elsewhere, and they come for political freedoms and the ability to live their lives in peace and free from persecution. I don't think that has fundamentally changed. I do think that there are serious policy issues that we have regarding the state of immigration, and I'm not advocating for any of the current policies in any way. I'm just stating as a fact, we have a lot of illegal immigrants in this country. We have to come up with policies around how to deal with the fact that they are here that cannot involve sending them all home for pure reasons of pragmatism, if not reasons of morality. And I think those debates need to occur. I think we need to have, in conjunction with that, a conversation about immigration policies, because I don't think that it is practical to be able to allow everybody into the country, again, from a purely pragmatic perspective. So we have to have debates about how we deal with those issues in a productive, civil, national conversation, because those problems aren't going away. But I do think that the question of assimilation, again, my criticism of the term nationalism isn't that there's something wrong with the word or the idea, it's that it has come to take on a particular connotation. And I feel like assimilation is one of those words as well. To me, assimilation is coming to this country and being in sync with the core values that I mentioned of economic opportunity and freedom from oppression, and contributing to something broader than yourself in that country. To me, that's the core of what assimilation should be. It's not about what language you speak. It's not about what country you come from. It's not about what religion you practice. It's how dedicated you are to being a member of the community here and to upholding those very fundamental principles. That's why I love, the description. I've heard it before, but it's a beautiful description of a mosaic within a frame. The frame is minimal. I don't like big gaudy frames on my artwork at home. I don't like it as, anything more than the minimum requirements of coming together to be a polity and to have the sense of mutual obligation that I think most of us talked about in our presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. You've been a very patient audience. Will you please come here and raise any questions or comments you have? That mic is just for you.
Thinking about your statement about the immigrants that come here and don't appreciate what they're coming to, gives me pause from the standpoint that a lot of immigrants from South and Central America are leaving something. They're leaving an environment that was really upset by a lot of our policies. Iran-Contra, selling guns in Central and South America, as Eisenhower spoke to in the military-industrial complex to keep people working. And these people find that they have to leave because it's not safe. It's not saying that they do appreciate coming to America. They can be safe, they can work, but a lot of them would still like to plant their coffee and bananas in Central and South America. And if there is some stability that is forthcoming, they very well may return. I find a lot of our policies around the globe cause a lot of instability, and we do that for our own economic interests. Iran's Aramco. Shah of Iran didn't realize he was the Shah until he was told to go back from Paris. We were behind that. Vietnam, we didn't learn. When Ho Chi Minh said, come, I need a little help, turn them away. Mao gave him some help. Years later, Ford, McNamara, the fog of war, he admitted, we messed it up, 58,000 on the wall. So we have to have some humility with our nationalism and consider the people that we are impacting and realize that we're doing it for our benefit.
Yeah, I agree with your summary. We have to have some humility before we presume to go abroad and impose systems on others. And I think you could envision an American nationalism that's aggressive, that's expansionist, that's jingoistic. But I actually think if you look at American nationalism and people who are espousing it today, it is the opposite. It is more of a suggestion that we have some humility about our international interventions. That being said, and I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree here, I think on the whole, America has been a unique and profoundly altruistic nation in its international affairs. Not perfect, for sure. Mistakes, for sure, but profoundly impressive and altruistic. And ultimately, I think what's driving immigrants to come to this country, and like you said, I don't think we disagree, mostly for economic opportunity, is because they don't have the same system of governance and economics creating the same level of prosperity back home. I think whatever fault may lay with us, far more fault lay with the corrupt leaders back home or the imperfect practices back home. All I would ask, and all I think is fair to ask, is that if you choose to come here for opportunity, pause for a second and say, maybe this country that has produced this opportunity, that has been a beacon drawing me to it, is doing something right. And I should try to recognize what they've done right, appreciate what they've done right, and dedicate myself to supporting whatever it is that made this a country I want to be a part of. And again, do I think it's a majority of immigrants? I didn't say that. But do we see a phenomenon? And by the way, it's not new. This has happened in the past. Do we see a phenomenon of some immigrants coming here and not having that approach? Yeah, it exists. It has existed. There, I would say, is where it's unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you for coming here today. One of the things I was noticed is your comment about more education and civics. I think that's a very good idea and would be an excellent way to begin, especially in terms of the assimilation. If the immigrant children are in our school and they're learning about civics, that's an excellent way to promote assimilation. But the one thing I was thinking about was I recently went to a committee meeting about DC statehood. And it seemed to me when they were talking about it, there were a lot of details, a lot of, can we do this with the 23rd Amendment? Can we do this with the Constitution? Can we do this with the way you've envisioned this enclave? But the key point was there are more than 700,000 people living in DC who are disenfranchised. To me, the education should begin most prominently with our representatives. Clearly, they were not embracing this. To me, a representative of a democracy or a republic should be saying, everybody should be enfranchised. What are we doing quibbling about details? Let's make it happen.
Let me just say before one of you takes it from here, that we recently just completed a study of civic education as part of our attempt to promote civic nationalism or patriotism. And it's been cut. Civic classes are cut across the country by about 2/3 because the parents push for academics. And to the degree that civic classes are taught, they are taught more like mechanics, that member to the Senate, so that many judges on the Supreme Court, and not as the kind of true civic education you're talking about.
Yeah, I think civic education is absolutely critical. Americans don't understand the basic facts about their country and how it works. You do have to debate the details if you believe in DC statehood, because you have to, again, I said I'm a pragmatist overall. You have to figure out how to have it happen. But again, I return to a point I made earlier. Our naturalized citizens, our immigrants, people who come here, know far more about our political system than native-born Americans because they have to take a test. Right? They have to take a test. I would love to see some, requirement of graduation from high school to be able to pass the naturalization tests to encourage that kind of education just on the fundamentals, nonpartisan, but just the very basics of our political system. I think every American needs to know that, no matter where you come from and no matter, where you were born.
Good evening. My name's Daniel. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. So a question rather than a comment. One of the concerns that often is raised through nationalism is a fear of other. One of the problems that's often going on in the United States right now is, and you can define other in many, many different ways based on the eye of the beholder, a fear of the other person, another culture taking over my culture, another idea taking over my idea, another candidate taking over the guy I think should win. So if nationalism should be resurged or nationalism should be championed around, how do we deal with the question of the fear of the other turning into something that could be toxic?
This is a very rare occasion to somebody succeed in stymieing the panel.
So I'll take it. I think that's a very important concern that you raise. Because I think if you espouse something, you have to be aware of how it can be abused. Like almost any ideology, a nationalism could be taken too far, it could be abused. And so I think when one proposes nationalism, one has to stress that it's the goal, in our mind, isn't to separate Americans one from the other. I think that's taking place and is being driven by other ideologies. The goal is actually to focus on what unites us as Americans, regardless of these superficial differences. And that's got to be stressed. And by the way, in stressing that, it doesn't make nationalists like me very popular, with extremists on both the right and the left. There's a debate going on now. There is a resurgence in this country of white nationalism, of people actually trying to say that there's something about being American that's connected to the color of your skin. And it's not just, Nazis from a bygone era. It's the young people are attracted to these views. So, to me, the answer isn't to say nationalism is a dangerous thing, we should stay away from it, but rather to get involved and get engaged in fighting what it is that unites us as Americans, what it is that defines us as Americans, and making extra clear that they lose and we win, and saying that these things don't matter. What unites us is our shared citizenship and our shared love of this country. The fight's on now, so I think those of us who care about these things need to be engaged.
Hello, I wanted to take a step back and talk more about globalization and how nationalism relates to that, specifically pertaining to what I was thinking of with international sporting events such as the Olympics and like the World Cup, and how you think that I think it both bolsters the nationalism while also forcing a form of international globalization as countries are forced to play each other in a more like friendly, not necessarily political way. And I wanted to hear your opinion on how you think that can help support both the nationalism resurgence and a future where we can all work together for a better global environment.
It seems like people enjoy rooting for their country in the World Cup. It's been suggested that some European friends of mine have suggested that the only hope for national unity in France and elsewhere is World Cup teams. In fact, the most recent France won last time, yeah? And people kind of celebrated that as a time of national unity as people celebrated the team. And so I think that can be a healthy.
Yeah, one thing you could say is that it often leads to very visible manifestations of the nation in terms of people wearing all their colors and the flags and the clothes. But in the grand scheme of things, it's often also viewed as a very thin form of nationalism and doesn't really last much longer after the events. To the extent that you do see riots occurring around the world at these sporting events, it's often not about the sporting event per se and more about long-standing issues that are brought to the fore by people in those situations. They used to say in terms of immigrants that the big test for them was whether or not they would support their home country, the host country team, the country they're now living in as opposed to the country they came from. And in Europe this was often a big test and has led to some conflicts when the people don't feel that the immigrants are supporting France or England. But again, it's not so much about the sport as these deeper issues. I don't know if it's tourist riding, but okay, we'll have to think about that. The other thing I wanted to say is that the capacity to bring people together in a positive sense. The big example with France was 1998 when they won the World Cup. The men won the World Cup, and it was a very diverse hue of players, and it was black, blanc, bleu, white, black, and brown, or Arab. And again, that didn't last very long. And so once the hangover was over, so I think these sporting events are very visible. They bring in a lot of money, but it's a very thin form of community, I would say.
I want to circle back to this fear of the other. It's another one of these fright words or fright phrases. I mean, some others should be feared. I mean, the Poles should fear Russians, given their history. They should definitely fear them. And the Latvians and the Lithuanians and the Estonians even more so. So I just think we should avoid these sort of omnibus descriptions of what our problems are. We can love things, the wrong things, in the wrong way. We should always seek to love the right things in the right way. And we should also fear the right things in the right way and avoid fearing the wrong things in the wrong way.
I think his part of his question actually was interesting. I wondered if I could also follow up with you. I think you raised it. His question was more, how do we avoid having the nationalism go too far into being aggressive and imperialist? And of course, everyone said that they didn't support that. But you, in some sense, said that you feel that the American values, on the one hand, you said you feel that the American values were the best. Then on the other hand, you said that it doesn't mean everyone else should have them. So I don't know how you can maybe hold those two things in your head at the same time.
I think they're entirely consistent.
Not just the best for you, but the best for everyone.
I think that can be entirely consistent. That's my belief about the values those are the values that I hold about what society should be framed in. But I don't necessarily want to impose those on everybody else in the world. I do believe they're best. But that is entirely compatible with having other people believe their system is best. There's nothing inherently contradictory about that. I want to go back to the sports question, though. Can I do that? I was grinning when you asked that question, actually, because I used to have this argument with my father all the time. I am an Olympics junkie. I will take time off of work to watch the Olympics. I'm a sports fan, and I'm an international relations nerd, and so the Olympics are my sweet spot. And my father used to argue with me every time the Olympics came on about, why is it that they have to compete by nation? I just want to see the best people in the world compete. And my answer to him was essentially a little bit of pushback against one of the things that you said, which was nationalism, our nation states. I agree with you that they're arbitrary, but they're our arbitrary. They exist, and that they have power because they exist, even if they were arbitrarily defined. And so my comeback to him was that I thought that the Olympics hit the sweet spot, because you march into the Olympic Stadium in the opening ceremonies by country. You march with your national flag. Okay? The closing ceremonies, when the competition is over, there's no more national symbols. There's nothing signifying that. Athletes from all of the different countries march in together with friends they've made in the Olympic Village. And to me, that's the sweet spot. It gets both elements of the common humanity, but the reality of how we organize ourselves. I know that this can be very controversial, but to me, that about gets it right.
I think it's very important to keep in mind this question, how we promote our values. Because if we just come to the world and say, this is what we believe in, now tell me what you believe in, and we'll have a moral dialogue, I cannot imagine anything more appropriate. If we say, unless you democratize American style, we're going to come with our tanks and missiles. The issue is really not, is it anything wrong without advancing what we believe in, but how are we going about it?
Hi, I think American values pretty much stand on their own. I don't think we really need to question them. It's based in the abilities, in natural law, natural rights. We're born with certain abilities, and one of those abilities is the ability to sense what's right and wrong in others. There's something there. Maybe we need to focus on developing it more, but that's not the focus. What I really want to focus on is the question, what is wrong with nationalism? Are we speaking of American nationalism? If so, I would like to ask you, do you feel American nationalism's problem is globalization, particularly political globalization and economic or financial? The money ruling what we do, the influence, and it has from its origin. If you go back and look at the banks, look at Hamilton and the banks. What's behind the wars? Who's benefiting? Who's profiting? Who's losing? What will we lose, American that is, under globalization? You're going to lose the Constitution? Human rights exist now. Who enforces human rights? Fortunately, we have the Constitution. We're catching hell, but we're fighting on it. And you talk about white nationalism. Really, yeah, it's been a pigmentocracy, skin color, because you can be of the same family, and one is dark and one is light, and you're going to be treated differently. So I guess the question I want to put to you, and maybe just a yes or no, is political and economic, or I should say financial globalization America's major problem?
Yeah, as I said in my remarks, I think it is. I agree with Nora about the consensus we had about the rule-based international order that served our interests, but more than just our interests. I think that in the Cold War context, we were able to keep those two things in balance. But I think since 1989, the global system turns out to have mostly benefited well-educated and wealthy Americans. And I think one reason it's lost, it's losing, I don't think it's lost, one reason is it's losing the support from voters on the right, and maybe even voters on the left, we'll see as the next Democratic nomination process continues. One reason it's losing support is that I think a lot of, high school educated Americans recognize that the system doesn't work well for them, the global system. While it seems to work miraculously well for people living in Palo Alto, California, or New York City. And so I think that is the great threat I think it's a threat to democracy throughout the West, in fact. And I think odds are strong that if I don't live to see it, my children will, that will evolve to, as I said, a kind of globalized oligarchy that administers everything that's important while maintaining the shells of democratic governance in the legacy countries that are behind. I think the European Union foreshadows that future, and it's one that I want to fight against.
We're just about to close, but let me leave you with one more image, which animated my attempt to deal with that in this new book, Reclaiming Patriotism. It's kind of an odd one, but it worked well for me. And that is when you compare successful couples who stay together to couples who break up, it turns out they fight about as often, but the successful couples fight better. They don't demonize each other. They don't attribute motives and such. And second, they remember we have some common good, let's say the children. So if this applies to the nation, what we need after Trump is first of all to return to civility. So we can have this kind of dialogues without demonizing each other. And second, we have to remember we're not just red Americans or blue Americans. We're Americans. We have some common goods. Now, before we thank the panel, I'd like to invite you to come back to our next dialogue. Is going to be on privatization. We're going to discuss the fact that we have now more private police than public police. We have for-profit prisons. We have more and more things turned over to the private sector. Is it a healthy development or a troubling one? Hope to see you here next time. And please help me thank the panel for an outstanding discussion.